Hi, welcome to LBI's panel discussion for the Shared History Project on Jewish life in late antiquity, a topic and a time period that Leo Baeck Institute hasn't focused on much in the past. But I'm pleased to introduce Billy Weitzer, the Executive Director of LBI, who will moderate the discussion and introduce our panelists. And one note, um, uh, we are streaming and recording today's program. So if you want to share it with friends afterwards, you can check the LBI YouTube page. We'll post a link and the program will be up there shortly. And we will be taking questions, and I encourage you to type them into the Q&A box, and we'll collect them to post to the panelists after they have a discussion amongst themselves. So, Billy?
Great. Thank you, David. And thanks to our panelists. I'm really looking forward. There's a lot to be learned about this era, and we've got a very distinguished group to share that with us. To begin with, though, I do want to introduce people to the Shared History Project. I hope that some of you are already familiar with it, and so I don't want to bore you, but I know that some are learning about it for the first time. More than celebrating 1,700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands, the Shared History Project documents the rich history of Jews, how they often were an integral part of life in these lands, and yet how they continued to maintain their identity as Jews, and how they often met prejudice, often had success, and above all, demonstrated their resilience. Shared History Project is truly a group endeavor. Not only did the Leo Baeck Institute staff work hard to put this virtual exhibition and related programs together, but dozens of other institutions allowed us to use their objects, and dozens of individuals wrote essays. We're going to display by the end of the year 58 objects, 2 essays per objects, plus 7 introductory essays to different eras. Today is our first program covering the first era, a very large one, from late antiquity through the Middle Ages, which begins with the Edict of Emperor Constantine. And I am going to share a little bit of our website with you in hopes that you will continue to explore it. I'm sorry, is it up? I can't, is it up, David?
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Okay, Billy. Good. Okay, it was showing differently on my screen. Anyway, I started with our first object, the Edict, which I know that our panelists will talk about. But my point is more to give you a little bit of a guided tour of, when you get to an object like this, you will see, as I mentioned, that there are essays. There's the provenance of the object, a description down to its size and who owns it. And then especially a view of a timeline that shows you where the object fits in that timeline and allows you to travel both through the objects that we show, but key events that we cite about the world and about Jewish life. And a map that locates all of our objects all over the lands that we are talking about. And then very soon, on the upper right, you see a virtual museum. We have a way that in 3 dimensions, you'll be able to walk through a virtual museum and look at the objects and see the information about them. Last but not least, I point out, log in, sign up. If you sign up, you will get a weekly reveal of objects, which we're very excited. And this week's object is the mikvah in Friedberg. And you also can view all the objects. We even show you the future. You see next week's object there, the Jewish ceremonial ring, but we don't give any more information. So there will still be some mystery as we reveal these objects. So I very much encourage you to sign up and join us. And I am, apologize, I'm just not seeing full screen, so I'm having a hard time unsharing. David, can you help me with that? Oh, God, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So that is the website. And now I'm going to give you a brief bios of our distinguished panel, who then will each speak for a short 5-minute introduction. We're going to engage in conversation. And as David said, we want your questions. So even while we're talking, if you put them in the Q&A, David will be collecting them. You will first hear from Dr. Thomas Otten, who is the founding director of Mikva, Jewish Museum in the archaeological quarter of Cologne, which is really the source of the project of 1700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands. Dr. Otten studied pre- and early history, classical archaeology, and ancient history. He managed the Rhenish Association for Monument and Landscape Conservation before heading the Department of Conservation and Preservation at the Public Monument Agency in the Ministry of Construction of North Rhine-Westphalia. He curated archaeological exhibitions on behalf of the federal state as well. Mikva is a partner in the Shared History Project, and Dr. Otten co-wrote the essay about the Edict of 321, as well as the introduction to this era of late antiquity through the Middle Ages. We will then hear from Dr. Werner Eck, who was professor of ancient history at the University of Cologne from 1979 to 2007. He earned a PhD in ancient history from the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. He is a leading expert on the history of the Roman Empire and was awarded the Max Planck Prize for international research for pioneering insights in the history of the Roman Empire. He did spend a year at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton and another year at the Sackler Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Tel Aviv. And third, you'll hear from Professor René Bloch, who is professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Bern, where he holds a joint appointment in the Institution of Jewish Studies and the Institute of Jewish Studies, in Institute of Classics. He obtained his PhD as well as his habilitation from the University of Basel. Recent publications of his include Der Jüdische Ring von Kaisergaust, Jew or Judean, the Latin Evidence, and Moses, Motherless with Two Mothers. As I said, I'm very honored to be on the same Zoom panel with these individuals, and looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So, Dr. Otten, if you could start. You're on mute, Doctor.
So, dear Billy, thank you for the warm welcome and inviting me to this panel. I'll start my presentation with a picture of the late antique palace, the Praetorium in Cologne, which was visible for the last 5 decades in a museum-like presentation, as you can see here. And this invites me to my special topic, the project of the museum in Cologne, which is, as you all know, the point at which the decree of Constantine points out the city of Cologne and the special evidence that this decree has for the early Jewish life north of the Alps, as we always say. I will argue from an archaeological point of view, because it's understandable that even after the early excavations in Cologne in the 1950 years, where huge parts of the medieval Jewish settlement were excavated, there was always the question about was there any former antique settlement of the Jews in Cologne. And I can say it right now that there's no archaeological evidence to prove this. Absolutely clear. This is approved also for the synagogue, for the mikveh, and for other buildings. So we try to focus in our exhibition for the future. The museum will open something around 2025. In research works about the early finds, because there's always the question, what do we have from the archaeological side for this first millennium as sources? And maybe it's a little bit hard to see clearly, but the red and the orange dots are for the Roman times in this mapping. Archaeologists always love mappings, and so we. And the blue, the bluish points are from the early medieval time or period. And you can recognize clearly that in these regions, north and northwest of the Alps, there are some concentrations of the late antique urban centers, as is Cologne, Trier, Augsburg, Augusta Venelicum, Kaiser Augst, Augusta Raurica, and other places. And there is a concentration in the later France regions in the early medieval period. But at the first point, you see it's a very frugal picture. It's not a very dense mapping. We do have not a lot of sources and even not a lot of clearly objects in the interpretation of themselves. And so we divide it into clear objects and objects with a question remark about their interpretation. That's a very hard point, or a concrete point. I will show only two pictures at Dura Europos and the well-known synagogue building there, here in the mapping on the left side, and the topography plan of the city, and the ground map of the synagogue and the court in front of. And you all know this reconstruction in the National Museum of Damascus from the wall paintings, here the west wall with Old Testament biblical scenes of Jacob with his sons and blessing his sons and grandsons. This is a picture that we do not know from any place north of the Alps, as I have to be clear. As you can see here, the pictures of the excavations in Cologne that I mentioned before in the 1950 years, the evidence of any building which could be explained or interpreted as a former synagogue from the antique times, we do not know. And this is a very clear point. So our concentration goes on the objects of the small finds as we mapped before. I will show some later. And we focused here in Cologne on the medieval period. This is the excavation plan of Otto Doppelfeld of the different, we can divide 5 building phases of the synagogue building from the early 11th to the early 15th century. And there's, as I mentioned, no evidence of a former building, of a previous building that could be dated before. So it's the objects, and that will be, I think today, a main point of discussion. How can we interpret such finds like this normal type oil lamp, but with this menorah as a motive, which we do know from the Rheinisches Landesmuseum Trier, or in many ways a very interesting place of Augsburg from the Gallus place, because in Augsburg we have the combination not only of the small find what is very interesting is that we also have lamps of this time with early Christograms, but there is also a building which can be reconstructed as the three-aisled basilica, which have Old Testamentally biblical wall paintings. So where we discuss about a function maybe as a synagogue. This could be the only hint, as I know from the regions in the north, where we can point out or interpret a building as a maybe as an eventually synagogue building. So Augsburg, very interesting here, and the fresco in this building could be the Joseph of Potiphar, which could be a hint on this interpretation. And other small finds, and that is the end of my presentation, to be very briefly here, is this grave find from Austria, today Austria, Halbturn, from the 3rd century, which was an amulet, a silver amulet with a gold foil, where there was written the Shema Israel on this foil. And there we have to interpret, of course, the special burial customs, the burial rites, which make it absolutely clear that this was an intentionally grave good and not unintentional. And so we have to think that this is a real hint, a real proof of a Jewish family which buried here in Halbturn in the 3rd century. So at this point, I think I will stop my presentation.
Thank you so much. Dr. Eck, are you ready to go?
Okay. Let me begin with a necessary statement. There is only one document for Jewish life in late antique Germany and Cologne. And this is a decree issued by Emperor Constantine on 11 December 321, which arrived in Cologne a few months later. So in Cologne, they didn't know it yet in 321, but only 1 year later. What was the reason for this decree? For several centuries, the Imperium Romanum ensured peace even in the Gallo-Germanic provinces. But from the middle of the 3rd century onwards, Germanic tribes from the right bank of the Rhine increasingly invaded these provinces. Many inhabitants of the countryside were killed, and large numbers of farms were destroyed. This also had a massive effect on the elite of the city of Cologne. These were the families from which the city councillors came, in Roman terms, the decurions of the city. These families had their economic basis in the countryside. They lived off the income that was generated there. But this income declined because of the invasions of the Germanic tribes. Let me see if I can show. For example, we have such coin hoards we find in this area, and especially from about 250 onwards till the 4th century. And many people died. For example, you see here skeletons of corpses quickly deposited in the Menorah in Geldova. It's to the north of Cologne. And these Germanic tribes had quite a lot of booty. And here you see something what they lost when they returned across the Rhine. So some families of the decurial status also died out. However, these decurions were not only responsible for the functioning of their city.
Excuse me, Professor Eck. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we can't see your screen. Could you try?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, could you try clicking on the should be a green button at the bottom that says share screen.
Right, yeah.
And we'll let you know when we can see it. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I go back for a moment. You here you have the skeletons. Here you have the coin hoards.
Mm-hmm.
And now okay, I can continue. However, these decurions were not only responsible for the functioning of their city, they also had to ensure the amount of taxes that had to be paid to the Roman financial administration. If it was too low, the decurions were made responsible for it. When this burden became too great for the Cologne elite, they looked around to see with whom they could share the burden. They saw that Jewish families, although they had the necessary income, did not share these burdens. The reason was that Jews had been exempted from taking an administrative task in the cities for centuries, since Caesar. When the Cologne decurions wanted to make some Jewish fellow citizens members of the council, the latter refused, citing their privileges. And the city councils then turned to Emperor Constantine, who answered the request positively. And here you have the text. The same emperor, Constantine, to the decurions of Cologne. By a general law, we permit all municipal senates to nominate Jews to the municipal council. But in order that something of the former privileges may be left them as a solace, we extend to 2 or 3 persons the perpetual privilege of not being disturbed by any nominations. Given on the 3rd and so on, it's the 11th December 321. The essential content is the decurions were allowed to elect Jews to the city council, even against their will. For Constantine, there were 2 reasons to cancel this part of the Jewish privileges. Firstly, the functioning of the cities was essential for the survival of the empire. Secondly, however, the decisive reason why Jews had previously been exempted from such duties no longer existed. City councillors and magistrates once had to perform cultic duties towards the pagan gods and the deified emperors, but this was no longer required. Therefore, there was no longer any special reason for this part of the Jewish privileges. Consequently, Constantine abolished this part of the privileges. All the others continued to exist. For example, Jews could still not be forced to appear in court on the Shabbat or to undertake work for the community on Shabbat. The decisive factor for Constantine was a fiscal aspect of the cities, nothing else. The decision in favor of the decurions of Cologne, however, had the consequence that Constantine's law had to be applied everywhere in the empire. For the emperor enacted a general law that allowed all cities to co-opt Jews into the council. The Cologne Jews probably did not expect that their refusal to share the burdens of the city councillors would have this consequence. And we do not know how the Jews in other cities reacted to the law. That they were pleased about is not very likely. Here I think I can stop.
Thank you so much. We've been looking at the edict for 2 years now, preparing for this project. And in that 6 minutes, I just learned more than I learned in 2 years. So very, very wonderful. Thank you. Professor Bloch.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the great work you're doing at the Leo Baeck Institute. As is well known, the anniversary which led to this panel is a decree issued by Emperor Constantine 1700 years ago. We just heard it in 321, relating to the participation of Jewish citizens in the city council of Cologne. This edict provides the earliest reliable written evidence of Jews from the Roman period in the northern provinces. But let me point to another anniversary, less dramatic in size, which is very much part of the sketchy evidence of a late antique Jewish presence north of the Alps. 20 years ago, a small brass ring with a menorah was found in Augusta Raurica, a Roman town in today's northwestern Switzerland. You see the map. The town of Augusta Raurica was built in 15 BCE and within 200 years or so developed into a thriving center of commerce with a population of about 15,000. The location of the town was well chosen, as you see, close by the River Rhine on the north-south axis between the Rhineland and Italy, and on the route from Gaul to the Danube and the east. In the unsettling times of the 3rd century, Augusta Raurica was abandoned and in 300 CE relocated further north to the river as a much smaller site, a Roman fort, the Castrum Rauracense, with a population of only 500 to 600. The ring was found in the rear of a building on a street which served as a main transport artery to the west of that Roman fort. That's where you see that little black star. Now, an ancient ring with a menorah, the Jewish lampstand with 7 branches, is quite rare. For the area that interests us here, north of the Alps, we know of just a handful of such menorah rings. 2 from Pannonia, modern Hungary, you see. The very few Fs for rings on this map. As a matter of fact, with regard to material culture from Jewish antiquity in the diaspora, not just north of the Alps, in general, from the Jewish antiquity in the diaspora, the evidence is generally very limited, to say the least. Even from Rome, where we know from literary sources that a very substantial Jewish community resided, reaching back to the 2nd century BCE, there are very few archaeological remains. There are no remains from a synagogue in the city of Rome, although we know from the many inscriptions from Jewish catacombs that there were about a dozen of synagogues in the city. Only at Rome's port city of Ostia Antica, remains of a synagogue with 2 reliefs of menorahs found on the Torah Ark can still be seen. You see here the slide of the synagogue at Ostia Antica. So when excavators 20 years ago discovered a ring with a menorah in what today is the Swiss canton of Aargau, you finally picture, it rightly created something of an international stir. Was this to be considered archaeological proof of an ancient Jewish settlement north of the Alps? Studying the ancient world, whether based on literary or archaeological evidence, often leaves one, as the late Louis Feldman from Yeshiva University once said, with 2 options, chutzpah or silence. In the case of the ring with the menorah from Augusta Raurica, we need to exercise great caution. No evidence of Jewish habitation has been found at the site. No synagogue, no mikveh, no ritual bath, no Jewish tombstones. In other words, nothing that could prove or at least hint at the existence of a Jewish community in the town. On the other hand, total silence is not warranted either. The find of the small menorah ring, the circular plate of the ring has a maximum diameter of 10.7 millimeter or 0.42 inches in Augusta Raurica, is significant. The ring is not the only archaeological finding of Jewish or Judean relevance from Augusta Raurica. There is a bronze coin from Palestine dating from 85-86 CE, that is during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian and the Jewish vassal king Agrippa II, mentioning both rulers, which was found in Augusta Raurica already in the 1970s. However, such a coin could have been carried by a Roman soldier who had been stationed in Judea. In the case of the Menorah ring, things are different. While technically, it is possible that a non-Jew could have been in possession of the ring in Augusta Raurica, it is very unlikely. What exactly does the ring show? First of all, of course, the menorah, which in antiquity was the most important symbol of Judaism. Today, the most well-known antique example is the menorah from the Ark of Titus in Rome, built in 81 CE. But as a Jewish symbol, it is quite a bit older, reaching back to the Hasmonean period in the first half of the 1st century BCE. The menorah from Augusta Raurica is surrounded by a combination of Jewish festival symbols. These are not only easily discernible today, but we know from other sites, not the least from tomb inscriptions in the Jewish catacombs from Rome, what to expect next to the menorah. On the left is an etrog, a citrus fruit that has a symbolic function during the Jewish festival of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. On the right, there is a longish indentation where there once was the symbol of a lulav, a branch of a palm tree, also part of the Sukkot symbols. It has been suspected by Ludwig Berger, to whom we owe a great deal of what we know about the ring from Augusta Raurica, that above the etrog, there was a shofar, a ram's horn. Now, be this as it may, as you can tell from the more or less contemporary Jewish tomb inscription from Rome on the right side, this is very much the symbolic language of Judaism at the time. Menorah, a lulav, an etrog, maybe also a shofar. The preponderance of Sukkot is striking, but not surprising. In ancient Judaism, this holiday was also simply known as Hechag, the festival. It was a joyful holiday, as it is still today, and arguably the only festival in the Jewish calendar in which materiality is at the core. Pagan authors such as Tacitus and Plutarch describe it in the early 2nd century CE and compare it with the Greek festival of Dionysus. Whoever owned the menorah ring in Augusta Raurica was in the possession of an artifact with a Jewish symbolic language that to many was known in the Roman Empire. The depictions on the ring are embossed. The ring was thus used as a signet ring, leaving an explicitly Jewish signature. Whether it was also in use in Augusta Raurica, we cannot know. Quite a bit remains open for debate. The ring is usually dated to the 4th century CE. That would be the time after Augusta Raurica's great time. But it was actually found in an area that belongs to an assemblage from an earlier time, the 2nd to the 3rd century CE. Currently, more research is being conducted on the ring. At this point, an earlier dating cannot be excluded. Moreover, only parts of the archaeological field around the site where the ring was found has been explored. What can hardly be doubted, I think, is that with the find from Augusta Raurica, we have strong evidence, and I'm going to phrase this cautiously, for at least a temporary Jewish presence of one person in Roman times. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unshare the screen and we'll back to some. Great. This was amazing and fascinating, and I have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask a few and see if we can get into a discussion. And then we are collecting some questions through the chat. And please, people, continue to put your questions through the chat. Perhaps we could start with a little bit of a larger context. I certainly know that this could be for Professor Eck, but the others could answer. We haven't mentioned that Constantine earlier than 321, if I have correct, was responsible for turning Rome Christian. I'm wondering, using evidence, and I respect what Professor Gluck says, we are guessing, we are cautious, but if you have a community such as Cologne, what is it like in respect to individuals, Romans who have become Christian? Have they received that word to Jews? And I assume there's a third group of pagans or whatever. I mean, are they together in this city? Are they, do we know anything about their, not just their practice, but their ability to identify with one another, or their ability that they're all working together, even though they hold these different religious identities?
Okay, if I may answer. Unfortunately, in Cologne, in Roman Cologne, let's say in the late 3rd and early 4th century, we have quite a lot of other information from, in part from literary sources, and especially also from inscriptions. Not so much anymore in this late time as in the 2nd century, but anyway, we have something. So what we can say, but unfortunately about Jews especially, we have absolutely nothing. And this is really surprising, because for Cologne, we have a huge amount of inscriptions altogether from Cologne and from the territory, because we shouldn't forget, Roman Cologne is not what we have now as Cologne, but Roman Cologne was about 100 kilometers along the Rhine, and to the west, from the Rhine to the west, about 70 kilometers to the city of Aachen. That was Roman Cologne. And for this area, we have at least 4,000 inscriptions. That is quite a lot, but not a bit about Jews. That is really surprising, but we have simply to accept this situation. But what can we imagine? In Cologne, there were living different ethnic groups. That is clear from the beginning. There were the most important part of the population were the so-called Ubii. That was a Germanic tribe who went from the right bank of the Rhine to the left. But then arrived with the Roman legions, with the Roman administration. There came other people from the southern provinces, from southern France, from Spain, and at the beginning, especially also from Italy. So we're all living together. And then in the next centuries, we can see there were people also from Alexandria, from northern Syria. We have, for example, from the city of Krefeld, we have a ceramic plate, and on the bottom is written in Aramaic letters the name of these people. So we have quite a mixed population, maybe a bit multinational, and probably also multilingual. It is clear the majority of people understood Latin, had to understand, because when they were more and more, they were becoming Roman citizens, then it was just a bit necessary to learn Latin. But we can also prove that at least to the beginning of the 3rd century, the Germanic language of the Ubii were continuously used. We have in the inscription, we have special signs that this is a reaction to their own pronunciation. They used these special signs in Latin words, but for Latin it was not necessary. But obviously they pronounced it differently, and so this is proof that they use this language. So what we can then suppose that, for example, Jews who were living in Cologne, they use probably also Aramaic. Why shouldn't they? We don't know anything precise when the first Jews arrived in Cologne. But if we look to the general history of the Roman Empire, if we look to the two revolts in Judea under Nero Vespasian, and then later under Hadrian, and also the so-called Jewish revolt in the so-called Diaspora revolt from 115 to 117, of course, not all people participated in these revolts, and so a lot of Jews left the country, in part beyond the Euphrates, but also to the west. And so it seems very likely that Jews at least arrived in the Gallic German provinces in the 2nd century, more or less at the same time when Christians arrived. We know it from, for example, from Lugdunum, that there was a bigger Christian community, and the differences were not very big. So I think Jews arrived in the middle, at least at the latest, in the 2nd century, middle of the 2nd century in Cologne.
That's fascinating. I'd like the other two to comment, but particularly in terms of what you're preserving in Cologne and the objects that Professor Bloch covered. If it was such a multilingual, it's just so amazing to think about 1700 years ago or 1800 years ago, so many people getting along. What did Jews do to keep their distinct identities? And is it in the buildings and in the objects that you're recovering?
We can guess that they preserved their own identity just by their own religion. I think this was very essential, the center of the life, what united Jews together. But if they were living together somewhere in Cologne, that we simply don't know, but that we don't know also for the other ethnic groups. So
right.
we shouldn't speculate too much.
Right. Well, I don't know if Dr. Otten feels differently about the area in Cologne that he's recovered in building a museum about.
Yeah, it's very astonishing from the point of the findings, because it's true we don't have any also smaller objects. Exception is one copper plate from an excavation of the Tana city's archaeologists here with a biblical scene of Daniel with the lions. But also that is not very clear, and René Bloch stated that very clear, that the possibilities and the limits of the interpretation of such small finds and objects is hard to do. And if we have any lack of inscriptions, it's not possible to have any reconstruction of a Jewish life, and especially of a Jewish community for the late antique times. So, but if we compare, for example, the situation in the 4th century for the early Christians in Cologne, where we have the historical source of murdering Bishop Silvanus at 355 through the Franks, we don't have any evidence of the early Christian church, of the bishop's church for the 4th century. It's dated very much later. So this shows that also the research for building activities at this time is also a critical point, because of the interpretation of archaeological remains. If you don't have, sometimes that are rectangular buildings without any specification, and if you don't have any fundaments of the Torah shrine or the Bima or other things, you can't interpret it as an early synagogue, but it could be. So this is our difficulty with the archaeology at this point.
Professor Bloch, you want to add anything?
Maybe I can add for Augusta Raurica, assuming that the ring points to a Jewish presence, and let's assume it's late antique, then there were certainly also Christians. There are remains of a late antique church in the northern part of Augusta Raurica. There were, of course, pagans. So if you want, but it's just very little evidence that we have for that place. One could imagine such a religious melting point. I would just like to add something about languages, because Professor Eck has mentioned the possibility of Aramaic evidence. It is striking how little Hebrew or Aramaic, the difference is often practically impossible, we have in the West. Even in Rome, there is very, very little Hebrew. Once in a while, you have a shalom at the end of a Greek inscription. Greek was the main, we saw this with the tablet briefly, or that golden foil. Greek was the main language of diaspora Jews in the West, and partly also in the East. Eventually became Latin. Practically no evidence for Hebrew until very late. You have to wait until the 9th century when we then finally have a little bit more of Hebrew inscriptions, and then 10th century we have Jewish Hebrew historiography. But it is striking how little Hebrew and Aramaic we have in the West.
Yeah. Thank you for moving the timeline a little further. I don't know how far your individual expertises go, but it is curious that that the Roman Empire extended into this area, that Emperor Constantine brought Christianity into this area, but then the Roman Empire collapsed. And I'm wondering if we have, what kind of evidence we have as we move on in time beyond Constantine and the Edict. What other evidence we have happened to Jews, or of Jewish settlement, or other changes that may have occurred with the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Can I? The situation of the sources is changing, because we have in the 5th and 6th and 7th century, we have quite a lot of literary sources, very different, especially from Christian side, that Jews were living in quite a lot of cities. And so it is in my opinion, these late antique literary sources from the 5th or 6th century, that is more or less the same as in Cologne. We have by chance his constitution of Constantine, but nothing else. In other cities, we have also a bit later literary sources. Why should? Because we have these are all by chance informations. Why shouldn't in these other cities also Jews not have arrived much, much earlier? I think just Cologne, with no evidence at all, only the constitution. But here was it was not a small community, because otherwise it wouldn't have been possible to include the Decurions in, they were rich. In any case, they had enough property to include them. And so why shouldn't it be at the same in the other cities where we have literary information from Gregory of Tours and so on and so on? So I think this is proof that in reality, also in the other provinces, in Gaul and in Spain, just in the 2nd century, there should be quite a lot of Jewish communities.
Right.
I agree with Professor Eck, and I mean, we all know that we have to be extremely cautious, but we also need to remember that the Jewish diaspora is a very old phenomenon. We are not talking about the post-70 diaspora, but a diaspora that goes way back to the 6th, 5th century BC. I'm not saying for the areas we are talking about, but as a phenomenon. And indeed, if we can trust the church fathers, Jerome, who speaks of Jews even in Britannia, in Great Britain, then we have a much larger picture.
Dr. Otten, you can answer that question, but actually I thought I'd ask one more question and encourage people. There are some things coming in through the chat, but we'll turn it over very soon. So please type your questions in. Also, I'm loving hearing what little evidence is and your ability to expand and think about what it might mean, although cautiously, I agree with the cautions. But what cautions should we have or what positive should we have in celebrating this 1700 years later? And also, as I understand it, there was some work done at the 1600 year mark as well, that in modern times, people have hearkened back to this edict and tried to make something out of it. And certainly Cologne is in the center of making something big out of the 1700 years. So, past to present, what can we take or what might we take that we're really exaggerating?
Yeah, the thing that you are talking about is especially the point of the tradition and the continuity. And if we state the few objects and findings that we do have from the antique times, we have to ask what happens in the meantime to the medieval periods, where we have in all the cities more or less the evidence of synagogue buildings and mikvahs and the uprising Jewish communities. Was there a discontinuity in these cities? We don't have any hint of having some evidence also in the meantime. And I think it's like looking for the pearls of a string, that you can see that, for example, in the early medieval period, as I showed in my first mapping, there was some evidence in inscriptions, for example, in Narbonne, in Arles, or in Vienne, which prove also Hebrew inscriptions and communities at this time, and also the consuls of Arles, for example, and Gregor von Tours, who rules the relationship between Christians and Jews. And that doesn't make any sense if there are no communities which were at this time of an importance. So I think we have to discuss about the continuity. And if I would show you a map of Cologne in the early medieval period in comparison to the Roman time, then you could think about the whole city was lost and forgotten and rotten and destroyed. That was not the case. We have also for this period in Cologne very few evidence, but we do have some, and the continuity in using the place as an urban organism was never lost. And I think we can state this also with the inhabitants and their complex structure with Jews, I think, for other places, not only for Cologne. And maybe this is the most important thing that we can discuss with the right over 1700 years.
Yes, well, I thank you. And that's actually, I know that's what drives, from Cologne, and our idea for the Shared History Project came from the work of Cologne. Actually, a visit by Jürgen Rutgers to LBI 3 or 4 years ago, and he told me about this project coming up. But it is so important when so much emphasis is placed on Jewish history, obviously in the Holocaust period, to make sure that everyone understands that we do have this evidence. I'd love to, we're going to turn it over. David Brown is going to read things from the chat, and I encourage people to add their questions to the chat. And we welcome more interesting conversation. David?
Yeah, so thank you for those of you who have typed in comments, the Q&A box. So please use the Q&A box actually instead of the chat, so that we can look in one spot. And I'll just sort of work backwards. Andrew Zalewski asks, for Dr. Bloch and other speakers, could you comment on the reasons for linguistic changes among Jews from Greek and Latin in Antiquity to Hebrew around the 10th century? Is it related to new migrations of Jews bringing Hebrew knowledge, or the inward looking by emerging Ashkenazim?
That's not an easy question. Again, the main question of Jews in the West, in the diaspora, was Greek, but not only of the Jews, especially minorities, were foreigners, migrants were speaking Greek. And it just happened that with the translation of early on, with the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, Greek became the main language of the Jews in the diaspora, and we shouldn't forget that when the Temple of Jerusalem fell, the majority of Jews lived already in the diaspora. So it has been for quite some time that Greek was the main language of the Jews in the West. With time, they assimilated more and more. We see this also in the Jewish catacombs in Rome, where the majority of inscriptions is also in Greek. But with time, we have more inscriptions in Latin. Why Jews sort of rediscovered Hebrew in the Middle Ages, again in the 9th and 10th century, that is still an open question.
May I add something for Judea? We shouldn't forget that Judea was under Hellenistic rule from the late 4th century BC. And we have just quite a lot of ostraka from the Idumean era. In the 4th and 3rd century BC, they were all in Aramaic. But with the rule of the Seleucids, it began immediately to be Greek. What the administration was always using Greek. And if we go to the normal inscriptions in the 2nd and especially 3rd and 4th and 5th century in Judea itself, the majority, also the Jewish inscriptions, are in Greek. That we shouldn't forget. So just it was a general phenomenon that the language which people in the whole East were using, it was Greek, even Jews.
The amulet from Halbton, as René Bloch mentioned before, was also written in Greek, but there was one question about the text. I think this is quite clear. I'm not a specialist in the inscriptions, but it's the hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's very clearly interpreted as the Shema Israel. And as I mentioned before, the special character of individual grave goods in this special case, I think, is a good hint about on the also religious meaning of this object in the grave.
It's an amazing find, but even there, while it's Hebrew, it's written in Greek. You know, it's very nice how the echad, God is one is the Hebrew is the Greek letter alpha.
We have another question from Bill Meyer, who wants to know why the Jews came, presumably to the German provinces or Cologne. Did they come as slaves of the Romans? And could Professor Eck explain what he meant by privileges that they enjoyed?
I think the privileges are unimportant for it's coming to the Gallic German provinces. But it's quite true. It could be that at least some Jews came also as slaves. We have from, and I will see if I can show it. Here, you have an inscription found in Puteoli in Italy, and there you can see Claudia Aster Hierosolomitana captiva. That means this woman was caught by someone in Judea, probably in 70 after the conquest of Jerusalem, and then it was brought to Italy. And there, someone bought this woman, and she was a slave, but then he freed. She became a Roman citizen. You see it, Claudia Aster. It was like her master, and then her patron, Claudius Proculus. So a part of these people could come to the Western provinces as slaves, but I think the majority not. They were, probably for economic reasons, to have the possibility to survive and so on, to survive. But special reasons, I couldn't say what these reasons were.
I mean, we know from inscriptions, again from Rome and elsewhere, that Jews were involved in all professions that all others were involved. In early research, one could still read that they were all in, tradesmen and doing. And doing business. That's a modern stereotype, but we know that Jews were soldiers, were teachers, craftsmen, and as in that function, we're also moving. There's nothing unusual about that. Many came as slaves earlier, already in 63. When Pompey conquered Jerusalem, and then again after 70.
Anonymous attendee asks, when and how did Jews obtain Roman citizenship? And suggests that there's been some controversy about this question.
Why should there be a controversy?
I don't know. Well, maybe you can settle it for us now.
Yeah, I think we have Roman citizens probably just from the beginning of the presence in Rome. I think when Pompey returned, René Bloch mentioned Pompey, he brought quite a lot of Jews as slaves. But in part, probably he also left them free. They became freedwomen, and then they had Roman citizenship. And look to a very famous people, Tiberius Julius Alexander, the prefect of Egypt, who participated in the conquest of Jerusalem. And just the whole family of the Herods, they were all Roman citizens. And then continuously, Jews had the possibility for different reasons, to become Roman citizens. And at the end, in 212, all free Jews became Roman citizens. No problem for them to be a normal Roman citizen. It was, yeah, absolute normality.
Well, speaking of controversy, if you can imagine the before times of the pandemic, when you would go to conferences and you'd all be, after the presentations, you'd go to the bar. Then what's something that you really don't know, speculate, that you really argue about? What can you think of what's a cutting edge debate that may separate some of you from others who are researching this area?
Sorry, that I did not understand.
I'm sorry. We're looking for, you said that this question that was asked is not controversial.
Yeah.
Maybe you could raise a question that is a very live debate that you are having with colleagues about this time period.
In general Roman history, or where?
Well,
we are living from questions.
right. Well,
maybe I can start with one. I mean, there are really many, and I already hinted at the language question. But continuously difficult and exciting question is the so-called parting of the ways question. When did Christianity and Judaism split?
Mm-hmm.
Was it early? Was it in the 1st century, early 2nd century CE, when for the first time we have in non-Christian texts Christians mentioned? Or was it much later? Was it in the 4th century? Or was it in the 5th century? I personally am more in favor of an early dating, but others will go in another direction. And linked to this, how much exchange was there? One used to think that Christianity is influenced by Judaism, takes a lot from Judaism. That's of course true to a large extent, but recent research has also shown that this also went in the other direction. Jews took quite a bit from Christians. We see this also in synagogue buildings where we have synagogues. So with regard to this exchange, it's more of an exchange than who influences whom. There are still debates in bars and on Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's a great example. Yeah.
Another point would be, for example, we have from some places like Essen a copper plate within graffito, which is Judea. And there is also the question about how far do we go with the interpretation of such an inscription or graffito? Does it prove the origin of the owner, or does it prove the religiosity of the owner? There are some colleagues who are more positivistic in their interpretations, and some are not. Mm-hmm. And this is always the question. This copper plate stands for several findings, also fingering with the Judea symbol. And there is Werner Egg and me discussed some days ago about a find from Cologne. It's a small lead sewer with maybe Judea, but that's not very clear. And there is a hard discussion about this object.
You mean this this object which was published some?
Yeah.
This is simply sorry. This is simply wrong.
Yeah.
But I have just
That's what we want to see.
I have just written an article. It will be published in archeologischen Korrespondenzblatt. It's absolutely against all methodology. No, but what I would like to mention, there was quite a lot of discussion about 2 inscriptions found in Kanuntum, in Pannonia, because it was funerary inscriptions, and there are people mentioned. For example, one Marcus Mulvius and Judaeus. Some people immediately said these are Jews, but this is probably wrong, because Judaeus very often in the normal Latin formulation means, first of all, someone coming from the province of Judea. And so therefore, either ethnic or religious, it doesn't say anything. So one has to be very careful. Then we have this discussion between Jews and Judeans, what I really don't understand. But some people, especially from the Old Testament, immediately reacted, these are Jews. But later, it was more and more agreed to that these are simply people from Judea. They could be Jews, of course, but that we don't know.
Well, this is so fascinating for me, both because we're learning about this history, but we're learning about the work that the three of you do. And I'm glad I asked this question about controversy, and someone put into the chat, they laughed out loud when I mentioned that you go to the bars and afterwards and talk about this, but I assume that archaeologists go to bars at their conferences and continue to debate these matters. But to me, the three of you have really enlightened a period that I think most of us don't really understand that well, and realize that you're helping us so much understand a story where you were just looking at specks of evidence and helping us tell a story. And it is a great starting point for the Shared History Project. I really want to thank the three of you for giving us your time and your thoughts. And I also know that you're going to repeat this in some different form. I mean, it won't be identical, in German. And people listening in, if they have colleagues in Germany that might be interested, please check in, because we will repeat this. And the Shared History Project will continue to do events as we move forward through objects. We're only up to object number, David, 7, 8? David, you're on mute. I don't know. Anyway, we've got a long way to go.
We just
at object number 7.
7. So we have
7 is the next.
a few centuries to go.
Yeah, and we're very excited, and we're standing on a great foundation provided by the evidence that the three of you have studied in your careers. So I thank you very much and look forward to future cooperation.